The U.S. Treasury Secretary, Janet Yellen, is currently in South Africa, where she's meeting with South Africa's Minister of Finance in a bilateral meeting as part of a South Africa visit. The areas of cooperation and mutual benefit between the two economies will be discussed further to deepen the already fruitful ties between the two states. Yellen lauded South Africa's bold participation in the so-called Just Energy Transition Partnership backed by the United States and other Western nations, but steered clear of mentioning U.S. concerns about Pretoria's planned military drills with China and Russia. The two would discuss countering financial terrorism, climate financing, resolving sovereign debt crisis in Africa, and global topics that will form part of a meeting of the G20 group of major economies next month. To discuss the political and economic benefits of this meeting, I have two guests, Frank Lekaba, a lecturer and political analyst, as well as Makwe Masilela, an economist. Thank you, gentlemen, for joining us on the news. I'll start with you, Frank, though. I'll start with you. The two high-level bilateral meetings for South Africa this week, Janet Yellen and her steering clear of conversations around South Africa's position with Russia and the drills they're planning with China. Makwe, what's your reaction to these two bilateral meetings, considering the context of the Russian and Ukraine war and South Africa's position?
I guess it had to happen, and maybe we have to see this as a 10-day trip in Africa. So yes, South Africa happened to be one of those stops that she was here. But all they're trying to do, everyone knows that Africa itself is the last frontier. And we've seen that also in the continent, we have a senior official coming from Russia and also from China. So my point here is everyone is trying to make sure that their ties with Africa continues to be strengthened. And yes, South Africa is also well positioned to be used, as a jumping board, into other areas into Africa. But it's not just all about South Africa here. It's more about Africa itself, because everyone wants to make sure that their ties are very solid. And remember already, these guys, they've got what they call an AGOA, which is helping African countries to have those trades with the U.S. So it's a question of solidifying those trade relations with the U.S.
All right, beyond the ties, being efforts to maintain these two ties, in your circles of economists, what is the interpretation being given to these bilateral meetings?
I think it works much better now, compared to years before, where you had the Western countries being dominant. So now they've got the likes of Russia, China, who are also playing a role into Africa, meaning when you start negotiating with them, it's more of talking more or less as equals, around the table, because we've got an option not to go with them, maybe to go with China or Russia. So those are kind of better talks that we are having now lately when it comes to the talks with the US, and also the fact that they want to start doing that case program when it comes to debt relief, and they start want to using Zambia, and we know it's a program that is coming from the G20 to see how can there be some debt relief. But already there's some clash there, because China is not too happy with the US interfering with other sovereign countries' debt. So now it continues to be seen how will this whole thing end. But for African countries to have a debt relief program, that will work much better. Remember, African countries, other than COVID, they also struggled because of Russia-Ukraine war, and also because of the rising cost, as we've seen high inflation and high interest rates. So poverty levels are still serious here in South Africa, and even the trade itself is not yet balanced. The guys are benefiting more than African countries are benefiting.
All right, I understand we have Frank Lekaba, a lecturer and political analyst, join us now. Good to see you. Glad the network didn't keep you away. So let me ask you, in the political circle, what is the interpretation being given to these bilateral meetings that we are seeing in South Africa?
Thank you very much. The political landscape in South Africa is has not yet expressed itself on the recent visit. But I want to assume that you know that Democratic Alliance, as a major opposition party in South Africa, has expressed itself on the South Africa stance on Russia-Ukraine war, and it has taken a side of Ukraine and all of that, of which the ruling party on the other side of the African National Congress maintains and supports the stance of the government as far as this is concerned, that it must continue to argue that the conflict can only be resolved by the United Nations Security Council. So that is the position of South Africa. It's not a position that you can attach to Russia or you can attach to Ukraine. It's a position that to a certain extent has been interpreted as a neutral position, but I think it is a principled position because the United Nations Security Council is empowered by the UN Charter to intervene in issues that threaten international peace. And in this case, the Security Council has really not delivered on its mandate as far as
considering the fact that the US and other countries are, giving sanctions to Russia and, expressing their displeasure to countries that seem to be supporting the war in Ukraine. How do you think this meeting will be interpreted by those who are vehemently opposed to the war in Ukraine, knowing that South Africa is considering an alliance of some sort between China in not too distant future?
Interestingly, in the U.S. Africa Leaders Summit last year in October, U.S. expressed its support for representation of Africa in the United Nations Security Council, which has been a major agenda coming from the continent to say we want a voice in the Security Council so that we can express ourselves clearly in matters of international peace. So the visit by the Secretary of Treasury from the US has to do more with economic issues, and I think you have heard from Tate Makwe. So it has steered clear of international political dynamics, but focused more on economic issues that have to do with development banks, how they can open up representation. I mean, here I think we talk about IMF and World Bank, how they can open up space for representation of the continent and stuff like that. But global political issues, it has stayed clear because for the fact that there was a US Africa Leaders Summit last year in October, which was, among other things, looking into these political dynamics and expressing itself and taking into consideration Africa's position as far as Ukraine, Russia is concerned. Okay. And the world is polarized, to be honest. The world is polarized, and Africa, not only South Africa, but Africa in the form of the African Union, has kind of taken a neutral stance in this war. So it is not per se South Africa's position, but it's a continental position.
All right, thank you very much, Frank. But I'd like to get the last words from Makwe quickly. What's your thinking? How is South Africa going to survive the game of neutrality in the long run if this war persists?
I think they will, Remember, South Africa, just like Russia, just like the US and other Western countries, they all have vested interest in South Africa. And as my colleague also said, if they had to continue with this whole issue about the UN Charter, the UN Charter states clearly that the Security Council, they're the ones who should be leading on this matter. And remember, when it comes to Russia and China, we are part of the BRICS. Also, when it comes to the Western countries, we're part of the G20. And I think we've got a leg to stand on to say that what does the UN Charter say when we've got these kind of matters? And as he said, my colleague, that definitely you need to see the Security Council being the ones who are leading on this kind of matters.
All right, gentlemen, thank you very much for speaking with us on the news.
Thank you.